room. And so I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. So thank you so much for taking time to join us for the rare rounds. We're excited for our upcoming discussion on developing legal agreements and research collaborations. And before we get everything kicked off, I just need to, of course, give some more housekeeping notes. It might be the last one of the day. First of all attendees are currently muted by me, the moderator, to reduce any interruptions. We encourage you to use the chat function in the Zoom window for any questions you have, and then the moderator will present those to the speakers. If it's a small enough group, we'll go ahead and unmute everybody and let you have that conversation. But the mute button is on the bottom of your Zoom screen to the very left. And if we have any questions that weren't able to be addressed by the speakers, or if we just run out of time, we'll keep your questions and try and circle back with you to answer those. So it looks like we are going to have an intimate group here, so we'll unmute everybody shortly, but we just ask that everyone maybe mute themselves when they're not talking, just to reduce the background noise, and do your best not to interrupt or speak over other participants, and of course communicate respectfully if differences in opinion occur. So in the interest of making us all feel more connected in this small group, we would really encourage you to turn on your cameras and be on video if you're comfortable. And if you have any technical difficulties or questions about the program, you can visit our help desk in the lobby, and we have a tech team and Global Gene staff that can answer your questions. And then finally, as I said in the introduction earlier this morning, please be an active listener. These opportunities don't come up very often, so try and resist the multitasking and be as present as possible to take advantage of this great dialogue around critical challenges in rare disease research. Okay, the best part is introducing our speakers. So we have today as our discussion leaders, Emily Milligan from the Barth Syndrome Foundation, and Imran Babar from Cydan. And they're going to each share a little more background about themselves as we delve into this conversation. But for now, I'd just like to invite Emily to kick us off. So welcome.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody. There's 5 or so of you on this call. You are the warriors for Friday afternoon. So kudos to you. I'm Emily Milligan, Executive Director for Barth Syndrome Foundation, which is an ultra-rare condition affecting young men primarily. My background is in public health. I was in epidemiology at Columbia University in New York for several years. And then I moved over into research administration at JDRF, which is the largest nonprofit funder of type 1 diabetes, where I oversaw about a $500 million portfolio. So if a contract or legal agreement exists in research, I've probably seen it in that capacity. After that, I then moved to Boston and I started a venture fund called the T1D Fund, where we would take private capital, invest in early stage companies to develop novel products for type 1. Having launched that fund, I'm now in the rare disease space. I've kind of been in the big charity, had a big charity experience in running research, and then also now in the rare space, much smaller organization that treats roughly 200 people in the US and 300 globally. So thank you for having me today, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
And hi, everyone. First of all, thanks to Susan and Global Genes for having me. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining. As Emily said, sort of you're the warriors late on a Friday. So I am the Chief Business Officer of Cydan. And Cydan is an orphan drug accelerator. So we're backed by venture investors, and essentially it's a company creation model. So we basically provide a home for rare disease projects, and we have capital to advance them to a stage in which our investors are able to fund them with a Series A, and then advance them further as part of a new company. I'm also the acting CBO of Tiberio Therapeutics, which is one of our spin-out companies. And this is a company that's in the orphan endocrinology space, clinical stage company. Prior to joining Cydan and Tiberio, I was in venture for a number of years, specifically worked at OrbiMed Advisors, which is a healthcare investment firm in New York. And they've got a few different verticals for investing in healthcare, but I specifically supported the venture capital activities and really looked at a wide range of companies in the life sciences space. Also spent some time on the sell side. So I was in equity research at Cowen, and covered a number of biotech stocks. And I have a basic science background, a PhD in molecular biology. And it was really actually towards the end of my PhD that I got involved in co-founding a nonprofit in the rare disease space. And this is, prior to that, I didn't really have a lot of knowledge about rare diseases. I kind of knew about them more generally. But it's around that time that I became aware of really sort of the unique needs in the rare disease community. And so the nonprofit was initially focused on helping patients get a diagnosis for their condition. So we basically provided access to genome sequencing using a crowdfunding model. And since then, we've expanded now to do a number of other initiatives, patient advocacy, as well as promoting research for rare diseases through some initiatives that we have. So once again, really pleased to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Well, thanks both of you for that introduction. Can we just start with the basics? So Emily, maybe you can explain for us, what are the different types of agreements you would normally have for research?
Sure. Actually, I'm going to back it up even further.
Okay.
I'm not a lawyer, and Imran's not a lawyer. This is our caveat, our disclaimer statement. If any of you are a lawyer on this call, please drop us a chat. We might pull you in at some point, but I think what we're trying to capture in this dialogue is you're probably running a nonprofit or have a role to advance your mission, and that's a very important position in your organization. So this is really about the art of the deal, getting the deal done. How do you approach it? What are things that you're going to ask for when you're trying to negotiate an agreement? So down those lines, and just to level set here, people think of legal agreements and they get the heebie-jeebies. I'm not a lawyer. How do I do this? Well, also, hire yourself a lawyer. You'll need one at some point. It's the cost of doing business. Don't cut corners with that. You can't play lawyer. You can only do the negotiations piece of this. And with the negotiations, you're going to start with what do you want? And if you're on this call, you're like, I don't even know what I should be asking, please let us know. We'll talk about some of that over the next hour. And then you also have to know what can you not accept, right? So I think there's the BATNA, if you've been in organizational change and negotiations, that's one of the concepts there. And then the agreement will be somewhere in between, right? So the agreements will vary. For research, you could have something as just a confidentiality agreement, which is pretty standard. And if you don't have one, you need to get one immediately. There's bi-directional, there's just one-way confidentiality agreements. So there's many different forms of that. And then one of the things I would highlight, and then
I know I'm on a call.
Others, is that for the early stage science, grant agreements, right? Those are legal agreements that will dictate downstream transactions or negotiations if an asset develops to a place where it can be translated or have options for a company to pick it up. So there you have the grant agreements, which have different components. And then clearly, if you are in venture or trying novel business models, then you may participate in a round of financing, which are very different as well. I'll let Imran speak to some of the other models and maybe dive into greater depth in those I just mentioned.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that was a really good intro, and I think so we use a number of different agreements. So obviously the CDA is kind of the first step, oftentimes, in discussing a collaboration with another party. We also use sponsored research agreements. So again, we have a number of those templates in place. Each university that we support, sometimes it can be, usually it's a university in our case, but whoever the other party is, sometimes they'll have their own sort of standard template that they'll want to use. We also do asset purchase agreements. Sometimes it involves even acquiring shares. So we're open to that. And then just the standard license agreements as well. The option agreements are interesting. I think that we've done a number of option agreements where for a set period of time, this allows us to do some what we call de-risking work or some validation work on a particular project, and we have a term sheet appended to the option agreement, and the term sheet will really define the terms for the license agreement, should we move forward and sort of execute our option to be able to move forward with the program, to license a program. And so sometimes, for the sake of time, we'll say, okay, well, we'll have an agreement that governs the option period. And it may not be as critical if it's a shorter option period. Maybe some of the things that you would normally consider in a license agreement are not as critical. So you can kind of delay some of those discussions. But then once we do the license agreement, we have the key terms, particularly the financial terms, pre-negotiated. And then, towards the end of the option period, we'll actually draft the full license agreement. And then we're sort of tighten up any components of which we needed to tighten up. So there really are, a number of different agreements, different contracts that are at play. And each of them are different. I think there are templates, and we were just talking about this earlier. There are templates for each one of these. Many of them you can frankly find online. But the devil is in the details. And I think in terms of the specific sections for each one of them, it's really going to depend on the type of relationship that it will be governing. And so I think that, there's not sort of a one size fits all. So I would just really double click on what Emily said. It's really important to have good counsel as you're navigating these documents.
Yeah, you mentioned templates, and that's a question that we get sometimes is, can somebody send me a template for how to do this legal agreement? And, would you encourage that or caution? Because, I know you're saying it's really important to have counsel, but can you start with a template to get you going, especially for people that just don't have a budget for legal counsel?
Yeah, we commonly, I use templates from past and present life in the job, but also Google, you can Google some. That does save you some money if at least you know what to ask your lawyer or your counsel, mm-hmm. right? So I think it's actually a good idea to at least review what's online. Now, as Imran said, the devil is in the details, and what you may read online, or you just don't know how to configure it because you haven't had that experience. In those cases, if you don't want to engage your legal right out of the gate, which you should have counsel retained, let's just say that. And you'll have different types of counsel based on the type of agreements that you are going to be generating. So we can also explore some ways of sourcing counsel later. Yep. But it's really important to reach out to your peers and understand, how do they approach this question? It's okay if you don't know what questions to even ask. People are very giving of their time to help walk you through and say, this is why it's important, this is what we do. And that will at least give you a baseline, because you really serve as a translator in many cases for your counsel. Counsel knows how to interpret the law. They can advise you very conservatively or slightly liberally on what terms that you should negotiate. That's where you have to have a strong understanding of what is your organization's values, what's important to you, and what are your priorities. Sometimes there's board input in that. But then you have to translate that for your counsel, clearly understanding what are some common things that you should be asking for, which you can gain from talking with your peer organization. So it's a different role, but it will save you some time if you do reach out to people, ask them those questions, look online, do your homework, and then go to your counsel and say, this is what's important to us. Let's build this in.
That's really good. And the other thing I would just really, and I love that analogy, we're a translator, and I think that's a really great analogy. Just in terms of the online templates that you'll find, again, I would agree with that. I think it can be really helpful just to sort of, get you oriented in terms of what are some of the key questions. I would just say, be careful, consider that a lot of times sometimes the online templates you find, they may not even be relevant for your particular industry. And so even different industries or different sectors will have sort of different provisions that are relevant, and some that are not. So just be aware of that. And then I think, once you have that, your lawyer should have, a lot of templates in place as well. And so then they can help sort of adjust it, according to, what your specific needs are. The other one sort of background, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just had comment. Go ahead.
And I guess the other, sort of background comment that I would say, and I think, what Emily said, we're not lawyers, so I'm not a JD by any means, and so much of my focus really is on the business side of things. And, so on the sort of the legal side of things, there are all kinds of points that, frankly, I'm not as savvy in. So, the indemnifications and the warranties and various components. But on the business side, I think that there are really kind of three key areas that I find, two different categories that, the questions fall into. One is ownership. And this just relates to, the intellectual property, the asset, the data, everything related to that. Who owns what and under what conditions? The second part is really control. Really who's in the driver's seat, for example, with patent prosecution, having freedom to operate, and then I think that, and also this relates to, sort of what is the fate of the program? So for example, using commercially reasonable efforts, or are there take back rights, or what happens, what are the conditions for termination, et cetera. So really control. And then three would be economics. And I think that's pretty straightforward. But related to the economics, it's not just the dollar number, but also the time frame and the conditions for which economics are being paid from one party to another. So that those three areas are typically the areas that I will focus on. There are obviously a lot of other things that you go through and they need to align on, but I think that usually, I think a big point for me is really finding that balance between what is really relevant for your particular conversation from the business side, but then also finding that balance between protecting yourself. And so a lot of times there will be times when we'll go to our counsel and they'll have a certain language in there, and we'll say, what, really from a business perspective, this is not very relevant for us. And this, I think, gets back to what Emily said, we're kind of a translator. And then when we sort of explain that to our attorneys, they'll say, okay, we get it. So, we'll focus it on this instead of what we were talking about earlier. On the other hand, I think that it is important to have, the legal protections in place. Sometimes from the business perspective, I may not anticipate it, but because our counsel, they've seen so many of these agreements and they've been around for a while, we have experienced attorneys, they're able to sort of pre-anticipate anything that could matter. Even, for example, like if we start out as a private company, we're in the company creation business, what if the company eventually becomes a public company? Are there any overhangs that you don't want to be a part, that you really couldn't have a part of as a public company, that you might be able to stomach as a private company? So sometimes, just being aware of those things, I think that's where good counsel can really help you out. So I'll stop my monologue there, but that was just sort of, I think, some additional background I wanted to share.
No, that was very helpful. So maybe Imran, you can go first, and Emily, you can add to this, but what are special considerations you have as industry working with advocates when it comes to contracts?
Oh, sure. So the first thing that I would say is that, we love working with foundations, and I think that, both Cydan and Tiberio, we have a lot of experience working with them in various ways. Sometimes just as a sponsor for a various initiative. But I think that we also have, we approach foundations in specific disease areas, really as a resource, and to really help us understand what matters in a particular disease area. And so, there's kind of a few things that we think about. So, Cydan is, we're very broad in terms of, there are a number of diseases that we've spent time in that we think are, indications that we should really focus on because there's a lot of medical need. And there are some areas in which we've gone very deep. But there oftentimes are diseases that we don't necessarily have the depth of knowledge immediately. We have industry experience and we know about drug development and the regulatory process and everything that goes into that as sort of considerations from the business and industry side, but we may not have the depth of knowledge in a specific disease area until we really sort of get up to speed on it. So the foundations are really, can be very helpful for us in that. And so, a lot of times, starting even just from the basic science, from the research side, sometimes we'll just shoot some of our contacts in a given disease, from a given foundation. And well, this is a mechanism where we're beginning to do some work on. Do you have any sort of thoughts on it? And does it pass the sniff test? And a lot of the foundations have deep experience. They've already, they're working with some of the key opinion leaders, or they have a lot of that deep experience specifically in their disease area. I'd say, equally important, maybe even more important, is even from the clinical side, what matters to the patient, and the patients in your community, what actually matters to them. So as we think about designing a clinical study with respect to endpoints, and what do we really want to focus on? I think people always talk about this, and so I think that I was almost a cliche at this point, but talking about registries and natural history studies, and I think that, again, as much as it's talked about, it is important, and I think that a lot of times the foundations will really be an amazing resource from that perspective. I think that when it comes to contracting, there's sort of variance in terms of levels of experience that a foundation might have when it comes to that. And I think that, on the one end of the spectrum, where an organization, a foundation may not have as much experience, I think in terms of when it comes down to, the terms of an agreement and what economics make sense, sometimes they'll undersell themselves and sometimes they'll oversell in terms of like what the economics should be. So I think that, for us, we think that, we do just try to rely on sort of what is sort of the industry standards. I think for us, we also want to, we are very motivated to say, if there's a foundation that we're working with, and this is also the academic group, we work with academic founders like PIs, we want to do well by them. We want to basically make sure that their the contribution is well recognized. So, that's another part of it. I think others, they're sort of well-oiled machines and they've done a lot of these agreements, and it's not necessarily, we're pretty easily able to come to, an agreement that makes sense. I think another big point for me too is, and I think this is all the more relevant in working with foundations, is really there's a certain point in which you have to do the paperwork, and I think that we all certainly recommend getting lawyers and really just tightening, getting tight on what the language is. But I think that we really want to focus on making it a collaborative relationship. So it's not just sort of by the pen and paper, by the pen and paper. We were just talking about this earlier, like an example where we have a very collaborative relationship with one of our parties, and the whole COVID situation happened, right? And so there's a certain time frame, and there's certain, but because we have a collaborative relationship, it's just very easy to go back with them and say, what, this happened, are you, and again, keeping the lines open. So basically, and there's another big point with foundations, I think, they really want to ensure the success of a particular program. And so I think for us, it's very important to have, really keep the lines of communication very open, and you're thinking about things like reporting requirement. So you might have what you require in an actual agreement in terms of like whatever that might be, whether it's, a couple times a year, you have a formal report, maybe it's quarterly basis, you have some, but just, if it's every couple of weeks, you just kind of shoot them an email and just kind of give it an update. So kind of keeping that line of communication open is very important, we think. So let me stop there. I'd love to, love Emily to, jump in and hit on anything that I missed here.
Well, you did.
Yeah, from an advocacy group standpoint, what do you strongly consider when working with industry?
Well, so I just a couple of things here. Some of them is like a Venn diagram where our perspectives overlap, and then you engage in a relationship because you see, it's like any partnership, you see they bring something to the table that you can't. And for nonprofits, we can't bring products to the market, particularly when it comes to commercializing a product without industry. It just, there's not a business model, a strong business model for that. Maybe with repurposed drugs, but even then it's challenging. So you bring a novel drug to market, you've got to work with industry for the capital, and I mean for financial capital as well as intellectual capital. I have 5 people on my team. I do not have the intellectual capital to navigate regulatory affairs, right? And those are very complex, specialized areas that you require in order to advance assets. So there's many different divisions within industry, even in small pharma, that you'll be bringing to the table by finding the right partner. To that point, when sourcing and looking at working with industry, we say that word industry to refer to commercial entities, but they're all very different. You've got biotech, you've got small pharma, you've got big pharma, you've got publicly traded companies, you've got private companies, you've got startups. It's a zoo with a lot of different animals in it. And so really understanding who's going to be a good partner with you. I can't wait to work with Imran here because he shares a lot of the same values as I do. There are other organizations, other firms that just don't. They are much more, let's say this, there's an expression, if you're not at the table, you're on the table and you're dinner. So there are people who want to collaborate with you, sit side by side, seek your input proactively. And there's others that will just let you talk, but aren't going to absorb or listen. And that having that awareness when you're talking with them through the business development process, is this going to be a good partner long term? Because it's probably going to be a multi-year relationship. Choose wisely. That would be my advice there. And then also when it comes to legal agreements, since this is about legal agreements, it's really important. You don't want to operate off good faith. And this was something that came up also as we were talking, is that in rare disease, sometimes we're just so happy. We're so relieved that somebody's taken an interest in us. We've been banging on doors for years saying, oh, I have this rare disease, my son has this rare disease, or my daughter has this rare disease, or I have this rare disease. And people don't see the market potential. And so you don't get the foot in the door. When somebody says, hey, I think we might have something that might work for you, sometimes foundations can say, I don't want to worry about, I don't want to call counsel, I don't want to make this at all contentious, I just want to operate in good faith because this is moving forward. I would advise you not to do that. My advice would be, this is just business. This is business as usual. Draft that agreement, have something in place, because if it does advance, and I have seen this to certain inflection points, then it's all about that relationship. And to the point that, Imran, what you're making is, you might get an agreement in place, but you can't go back and say, well, in provision 5.6 Roman numeral 5, it says this. Once that agreement is executed, it really becomes a relationship management engagement. And that's where, if it's not a good cultural fit, you'll have friction. So again, you have to make that transition. It might be on paper, but unless you want to litigate, it's not worth it sometimes to go back to that point and reference it repeatedly in your interaction. Instead, you're going to really rely on the interpersonal relationship that you cultivate over time to be able to advance your research program.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I'm muting the participants again because I'm curious to know, since it's such a small group, kind of which side are you representing? Are you with foundations and patient groups? Are you with industry, or are you with maybe an academic institution? Anyone care to speak up and share? Maybe we could start with Mary Beth. Okay, how about Kate?
Hi, this is Casey. I'm with a patient advocacy group with Smith-Magenis syndrome, parents and researchers interested in Smith-Magenis syndrome.
Okay, thank you. And how about you, Keith?
Hi there. I'm from Cure Grin, so it's a parent advocacy group for grin disorder.
Okay, fantastic. And how about you, Dania?
Hi, I'm with the nonprofit PSP and CBD Foundation for Progressive Supranuclear Palsy and Cortical Basal Degeneration.
Okay, thank you. And Anne-Marie?
I'm the CEO of Lipidgenics, and it's a newly started company that's looking at applications in several rare diseases.
Fantastic. And Mary Beth, do we want to try you again?
Sure, can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't get my mute
That's
off.
all right.
I'm with NCATS, and I am the project lead on the toolkit and on Radar.
Oh, fantastic, welcome. And I'm not sure I'm gonna say this correctly, is it Pirette? I know she has some background noise, so she may choose not to, not to answer. Maybe you can put in the chat what organization you're with. How about Sylvia?
It's okay, I unmuted myself for...
oh, good, okay.
Yeah, you are correct. I do have 9-year-old behind me, very active and very noisy, so I'll try to be quick. But I'm a parent of a child, and just a few months ago, a few of us, we came together and we started a nonprofit. So we are extremely young organization, and yeah, I'm here to learn. So I'm very interested in everything that you guys have to say.
Thank you. And it looks like Sylvia's connecting to audio. Are you able to chime in here, Sylvia? Okay, so maybe she'll let us know on chat. So it looks like mostly patient advocates, a friend from, we've got one industry and one, someone from NIH at NCATS. So I wanted to ask you both, what tends to be some common sticking points in contracts or in agreements? that we can potentially avoid? Where do we usually get hung up? Imran, you want to go first?
Sure. I can go first. And I think, a lot of it does come back to, the points that I highlighted earlier, in terms of sort of the three kind of buckets that we focus on, when it comes to, ownership, and control. Those are obviously, I think those are pretty obvious. Economics, I think, does end up being somewhat of a sticking point at different times. It really depends on the party that we're talking about. So it really depends on, so for example, if it's an academic institution, one of the things that we have, sometimes had to do sort of multiple rounds of negotiation on is basically how is data treated. And I think that, there's a balance between, wanting to, maintain a competitive advantage, which I think that to give the company, to give our investors confidence that we're able to move forward, and that IP is going to be able to be filed, and they have sufficient time to file that IP before it becomes part of prior art or sort of commonly known knowledge, and the university's responsibility to basically make data publicly available. And so I think that sometimes, and I think that it's definitely a lot, there are hundreds and thousands of agreements that happen, but in the case of a sponsored research agreement, just making sure that you're able to really, both sides are very comfortable about what happens. So publication rights, announcement rights, the conditions of confidentiality, so I think that those are some points that we oftentimes will end up needing to negotiate. I think that another one is just basically related to this comes down to control, and I think some of it is related to the option period versus the license agreement, right? Because there's differences between the option period and the license agreement. So even things such as who's prosecuting patents, and who's paying for that. Again, not huge issues necessarily, but I think that those are things that we'll need to focus on defining. Termination rights is actually another big one. This is one that I think that again, our lawyers will kind of play a pretty big role in terms of just making sure that there are protections in place with respect to terminations. What are the conditions for termination? So just understanding that. Things like take back rights. Are there take back rights? And I think that these are things that are important to consider. For example, I think especially from a nonprofit perspective, if you have, let's say you have an asset and you're working with a partner, you just the big thing is you really want to make sure that that asset is being advanced. And again, we talked about this during yesterday's session, but what you'll always find is this term commercially reasonable efforts, or CRE, and I think that that's pretty standard language, but it's really challenging to actually demonstrate that a company has not used commercially reasonable efforts, right? And so I think that with that in mind, I think it's just important that you're very open with your collaborator. Just okay, well, what are the time frames? And really kind of define to the degree that you can, defining it as much as possible. And I think that from the industry perspective, my company might push back and say, well, there's just a lot of things that we don't know, so we'll try to keep it pretty general. But I think from the foundation perspective, just really, and even if it is, in the agreement itself, where, maybe it's not sort of fully fleshed out, making sure that you're having, sort of those regular communications as we talked about earlier, really just what happens to the fate of the program. I think those are points that oftentimes need a bit of finessing, I guess you could say, in the agreement. And the most obvious one is obviously, I think, is economics. I mean, I think that's, again, what is a program worth? And there's a lot of this really ties to the stage of the program, right? So if it's like, mid or early stage preclinical program versus something that's, maybe in the clinic or almost in the clinic, or maybe it's a phase 2 stage asset, that's a very different story, and those are very different economics. And so I think that, how, and then from the business side, a lot of our investors will ask, well, how big is the market opportunity? Is there an opportunity to expand it to other indications? For example, if it's a drug that we're licensing. So there are all kinds of things that you have to take into consideration. The key point here is there's not a one size fits all. And so it's really going to depend on what the asset is, what stage it's at. But, the economics are obviously a point of negotiation. And, some parties, there's different levers that you can have in a license agreement. So you have, whether depending, do you prioritize near-term economics? For example, do you need money right away? You need an upfront payment. You need sort of early, sort of near-term milestones to help you try to fund more research if that's a priority for you, or to get back the money that you've invested in a project. Or do you prioritize sort of your downside economics, where you say, I really believe in this, but we don't need money right away, but we do want to recognize more of the upside. So then you might say, well, I want some downstream milestones, maybe some commercial milestones. You might focus more on the royalty rate. that sort of thing. So I think those are points that, are oftentimes, they're sort of negotiation. Let me stop there, but Emily, can you help fill in?
I'm just going to chime in really quick, and then I'll give Emily a chance to respond too. But you mentioned the importance of protecting data for competitive reasons. Do you think that given the COVID climate with such openness and transparency in sharing data is going to set a new standard for more openness?
That's an interesting question. I think in some, I think in certain situations, I think I have seen that in terms of there are some big announcements where I think please don't quote me on this, but I think it was I want to say it was Biogen and Vir, where they announced that they were just going to move forward with a collaboration without having the paperwork finished, and because again but keep in mind I think it was George, who was the CEO of Vir, used to be the CEO of Biogen. So there's like obviously a lot of overlap, a lot of sort of like, understanding and trust between the two organizations. They're like, like we're just going to move forward and plow forward, and we'll take care of the paperwork sort of on the back end of that. So I think that again, that's great. And, I think that, part of it does relate to, if you're an early stage rare disease company and you're like a single asset company, or you're, that becomes a bit more difficult, I think, because especially from the investor perspective, where if you think that for example, even IP is really critical, right? If you publish something too early, or if people talk about it too early, and then all of a sudden you lose your competitive position, and that's the only asset that you have, and you're already
banking on that, yeah.
You're banking on it. You're already
literally.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think some of those questions I think are still going to be a part of the discussion, even in the post-COVID era.
Yeah, fair enough. So Emily, the question was, what are some of the typical sticking points? We heard Imran's point of view, but what's been your experience?
Yeah, and I'll say it's going to be interesting, I think, with video conferencing just around IP, because the collaboration, commonly you go visit somebody in their office and you talk more, you can share information that may not be publicly available, but with screenshots and other things, I'm just not sure how that's going to pan out. That's probably another whole
topic. Good point, yeah. Another ripple in the pond, right?
Because I've seen, so one of the sticking points, especially if you have a tri-party agreement where you might have money coming in from industry, working with an academic partner, and you being a nonprofit engaged in this process, I've seen where academia sometimes doesn't really appreciate, they're not entrepreneurs generally. There are a couple that wear both hats, but they're interested in generating knowledge. And so I have seen some of those disclosures happen, which have then jeopardized some of the financial interest that the company had made in that development program. So there's, again, you might have something on paper, but in practice, if people don't understand what they're getting, what they're obligated to, it doesn't help you, right? So some of the things that you will try to make sure they're built in, clearly the confidentiality, clearly the disclosures. Milestones are really interesting. And this extends not only to a later stage program, but also even early stage, like preclinical work. I wouldn't say discovery, but preclinical, where you might consider having a steering committee where if there's a company involved, or if it's just, say, you are funding everything solely, right? You funding an academic institution, you might say, well, we're not going to make that payment until our scientist approves that this actually was achieved. You lay that out up front. Some organizations might say that that's a risk to us because we're going to perhaps be operating in the red, we really need that payment. So just be cognizant of what you're asking for. Understand if you're not going to have the resources to even pursue something, is it worth negotiating ad nauseum to get that clause in there if you aren't going to be willing to go to bat for it? I've seen that some on patents and IP where the organizations they fight for something that they're not going to pursue. Why do that?
Yeah.
I was going to say one more thing. The other thing I think is really important if you're working with industry, we see, so especially small companies, they probably have an exit strategy, or they want to be incorporated or bought by another organization or firm. So the mergers and acquisitions, while that could be really good for you, it could also represent a threat. Companies also change their strategy. So if you are not securing, like, this program has to advance in this given disease area, then they can easily shift direction at no penalty. And just consider some of those downstream phenomena that could happen in a project when you're contracting up front.
Right. That's good advice. So given the fact that we have many patient advocates and foundations in this room, talk to us about how much we should expect to spend perhaps on attorneys to do these kind of contracts. What are some of the pros and cons of using pro bono counsel?
Yep.
How do you even go about pursuing that?
Right. First thing I would do is talk to your peers on this call. I'm sure Global Genes can help connect you with people that have counsel that they highly recommend. But that reference, that referral is really important. You have to find somebody who's specialized in your area. And have that depth. When you're talking about making an investment in a company, the equity, even royalties, and trying to figure out how we're going to calculate the net revenue, just certain terms. You want to talk to lawyers that have a presence and have other clients in this space. You don't want off the side of their desk somebody who's working in IP to advise you on an acquisition, right? So just be cognizant of that. I personally have 2 different lawyers that I use. We're very resource limited, and those are people that we do pay. They give very competitive pricing. So for just price points to put out there, I see everything from like $5.50 an hour discounted. The associates charge much less, and I've seen something up to a couple thousand an hour. We don't have one of those retained presently. But it depends on the capability of the organization, what type of agreement you're trying to put in place. If you're building a new business model, you're looking to spend a lot of money. In some of my multi-million-dollar deals, I can spend easily like $50,000, $60,000. Smaller deals, I try to stay under 10 and cut corners where I can because of those templates that I know that work, right? I know what I need to negotiate.
Yeah. And I think yesterday's discussion, somebody threw out the term I had never heard before, and it's low bono versus pro bono, and why that's sometimes better. Do you want to add some color around that?
Well, I mean, so you might have somebody on your board who is a lawyer. If they are on your board, chances are, depending on the state, I believe, I'm not a lawyer here, they may not be able to advise the foundation because it represents a conflict of interest. However, they can sometimes just look at things and kind of say, I think you should probably talk to counsel on this before engaging counsel, which could save you a 15-minute timestamp of how they bill, right? Or they'll get one of their partners involved, and sometimes their partners will do it pro bono, sometimes it's low bono. I see a lot of that, and I mean, that brings buy-in. It helps with your volunteer feeling like they're able to contribute in a way, which all of us in nonprofit fully appreciate that value, and helps to bring in very qualified professional services.
And Emily, I think you made a really good point yesterday as well, just about, some of the advantages of, pro bono or low bono versus the disadvantages, and obviously the cost being, an advantage, but then, maybe a disadvantage being the time frame. I thought that was a really good point that you made.
Thank you for reminding me. It's Friday. Because if it is pro bono, what we have seen, and because a couple of firms, some really big. Excuse me. So a couple of the big firms will have a corporate responsibility arm or social responsibility arm. Well, they'll put in so many hours of FTE time towards a nonprofit. And you can apply to these, or sometimes there's other mechanisms that you can get in front of, whereby you can get in front of them and they'll say, yes, we're happy to represent you on this formally. However, the trade-off can be that it then takes an enormous amount of time to get for them to get back to you. They have a high-paying client come in and say, I need this urgently. Guess who gets punted down the rungs? You.
Yeah.
So evaluate the trade-off in way of cost and versus urgency, because sometimes you've got to get this done. I think nonprofits, and Ron, I want like your opinion on this. We are constantly trying to fight a stereotype when it comes to working with industry. We want to be seen as nimble, professional, experienced, an equal partner. And if it takes you 4 weeks to get back with red lines, guess what? They're not going to see you as a good partner or somebody that's going to be worth their while in some cases.
That's a really good point. It's a good investment to make to move the process along.
Your brand, you're building your brand.
Yeah.
Completely agree. Yep.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we have another question from Casey, and she's asking, what legal agreements would you have in place around the use of patient registry data? You want to take that one, Emily?
Well, so can I ask a little bit more? What do I mean by use of patient registry data? Sometimes you have a contact database. Sometimes you're looking at different like frequency or incidence of conditions.
I'm wondering if she's meaning use of agreements with patients to be able to use their patient registry data, and perhaps you mean sharing patient registry data with research partners. Is that right, Casey? Oh, she says she's on mute. Sharing with research partners.
Okay, so
I can't unmute right now.
That's fine. Oh, that's totally fine. I left my kids at home, and so I don't have to deal with them right now, so I get it. This is what I would advise. I have seen people turn over a de-identified data set to industry. It's cross-sectional, but you've turned over a lot of information. I would not do that. I would advise, and people are starting to get a little smarter about this. However, it really depends on the quality of the data that you have. And we could have a whole discussion on registries and what they are quote unquote worth, because there's a lot of different types of registries out there, let's say that would be worth different to a partner. One of the things I would advise, and I've seen work pretty well, is say, hey, we're happy to run an analysis. What questions do you want answered? We'll do this. As a matter of fact, why don't you off like $5,000 or I'm just putting a number out there, pulling it out of the hat. Because we're going to have to pay somebody to do this, but sometimes they'll see that as a low investment to validate, yeah, that we might move forward. It's not a lot of money out of their pocket. You're bringing in somebody that they think is qualified, that is a third party, independent, and that keeps a firewall between the two entities. That's a model I've seen work that I would recommend personally. I don't know if Imran has a different opinion on that one.
Yeah, no, I think that's good, and I can't say that I probably have less perspective than you, Emily, on that. I think the one thing I'd highlight is that a lot of it does depend on who the partner is. And especially as it comes to economics, I think, so for a company like Cydan, where we're pretty, kind of a startup feel to Cydan, we don't have a huge budget to do some of these projects that will help us validate a particular approach. So, we're talking, 10 to 20,000 is kind of like our limit to be able to really, kind of dig into a particular area. And again, we try to be pretty frugal. Whereas a pharma, like that's a drop in the bucket for them. And so, they're able and willing to pay more for a data set like that. So I think that, that's it. I think in terms of the types of agreements, I mean, I think, obviously, I think a lot of it does come down to what I mentioned before about, ownership and control and how the data are going to be used, right? And so I think that just understanding, and again, there are going to be specifics that are just going to be relative to whatever the particular relationship is. But just understanding like how that data is going to be used, who's going to own the data, et cetera, et cetera. So those are things that I would focus on in those agreements.
Mm-hmm. And who should be involved when in the process of formalizing a research agreement? Imran, do you want to start with that?
Sure, absolutely. So, I would say, and again, I'm going to steal an answer from, I think it was Emily or from yesterday that you start off with me. But I do agree with Emily that I think that, get the researchers obviously are going to have to be involved in terms of really understanding the science. And then really, is there a there basically? Is there something that's actually there? So I think that's a really important point. But I think once you're at that point of, okay, well, there's something here, and there's something that, whether it's the, the underlying biology is well understood, et cetera, I'd say that once you're at the point of starting to think about, actually spending money on a project, where there's going to be, change in hand of dollars. And I think that, you really do want to have an agreement in place to kind of govern that. Right. And I think that, and it's not even just money in place, but I think where you were talking about, where there's studies and there could be IP or data that's generated, that sort of thing. I think that, you really do want to have those agreements in place, as we talked about before, just, you can't just sort of, in good faith, just kind of like go forward. And I think sometimes, it's tempting to do that for the sake of speed. But, and I have to, in full disclosure, actually we do that sometimes at Cydan, because again, we call ourselves an accelerator. And, sometimes we're like, what, we're willing to do these at risk. We're willing, and I think for us, maybe it's probably different than, for example, if you're a foundation with maybe a more limited budget. And for us, was, what, if we do these experiments at risk and, $50,000 down the road, that's a loss for us, but it's not the end of the world. And we'd be willing to pay for that in order to accelerate the project by a couple of months or a few months in this particular case. And so sometimes we'll just do experiments at risk. But I say, generally speaking, I think that, you do want to have the contracts in place as soon as possible, especially once you're starting to generate data and when dollars are exchanging hands.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts, Emily? Who should be involved and when, and what, in the contracting process?
Yeah, so I have a really simple answer, and it is, as Imran was saying, you're going to start off first with the technical review, right? Is there merit here on a scientific level? So you have to have scientists talking to scientists. That's a bi-party conversation, assuming it's a bi-party agreement. And then as soon as you recognize, there might be something here, let's advance this and start talking about how we're going to execute it. Then you've got the business people, right? Mm-hmm. And so if Ron was on the phone for Cydan, I'd be on the phone for BSF. You have to have that, because otherwise what happens? You've got a scientist talking to a business person about things they don't really know, or what questions to ask. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, going back to that concept of brand building, that's more frustrating than to have a phone call and you don't have the right people on the call, because then you got to circle back and start all over again. It leads to misunderstanding. It's just not a good scenario. So you get business people on the phone, you better have business people from your side. If they have counsel on the call, which as you get to refining certain clauses in the agreement, counsel will usually hang out in the back. You won't see them very much. It's a business person that's going to be interfacing with you. But counsel's behind them, because they are the quote unquote translator. They're going back and say, hey, we need to fix this in the agreement. Can you make these changes? And then we have that discussion again. But as soon as counsel gets on the phone call, and there usually is a time towards the end, at least that's been my experience. Sometimes it does come a lot earlier in the process, whereby when you're really going through, like, is this a the or an especially on IP, it's like, okay, guys, let's get everybody on the phone, and then you have your business. Usually you'll have your lawyers, and sometimes you don't have your PhDs. But in general, the principle is you have the counterpart for whatever division, let's say, that is on that call, or that needs to be on that call.
Yeah. And one other point is, and I'm thinking about a recent deal that we've been working on. I think it relates to the other point, that was highlighted in terms of the different types of lawyers. And so for us, there's really sort of, I guess, 4 categories of groups that we work with. One is we have our lawyers that focus on IP, intellectual property, and that's a completely separate group. We have another group that focuses on the contract side of things. So, for example, license agreements, sponsored research agreements, option agreements, etc. So again, we have another group that really specializes in that for us. And then we have an entirely different group that does more of the corporate matters for us. So when it comes to, term sheets for starting a company and sort of the very corporate matters when it relates to equity and that sort of question. And then the fourth would be, we have somebody work with just an individual person for like some of these just very quick and easy agreement. Whether it's a CDA or what, and again, I can go through a CDA pretty quickly and determine whether there's something, but just give it a sanity check, for example. So again, on some of these like very quick contracts. But so I think that sometimes just knowing who's going to be the best person to specialize in a particular agreement. The reason I thought of that is because there's actually been cases where we've actually scheduled and basically connected different groups of these lawyers together. And I'm thinking one in particular where there was a contracting question that related to intellectual property. And so then our lawyers who are on the contracting side interface with our lawyers on the IP side of things, really make sure that the language and exactly what we wanted, it was really included in the agreement. Again, I think that you're adding up lawyer lawyer bills as you're doing it. Sometimes it can be necessary to think about
I want to add one more thing to that, because please listen to this next statement. Everybody
listen.
Listen. You may want to try to save money by having the other party draft the initial agreement. Think about it though, because if you know that you want certain points built into this agreement, it might save time and money long-term if you draft first. And Ron, do you agree with this? Because sometimes if they get off on the wrong track, then you're trying to reel them back and it's already on paper. Sometimes it's just better that you take that first stab at it and write down, like, these are the things we want, see how close it matches up to theirs versus the other way around. Yeah. So again, saving money may not save you money in the long term. That's one of my plugs to breaking out the pen earlier in the process.
Yeah. So we just have a couple minutes left. I think this was very helpful and productive. If there's no more questions from our participants, any closing remarks you want to make, any reminders or something to urge everyone like you just did?
I'm happy to go first. I would say reach out to peers. Again, this is very, very general comments. I know you're probably getting to, as soon as you say, I'm going to work on an agreement, you're going to have all these questions. Reach out to people. We're very giving of our time and what we've learned through the process, because we want to see you be successful and we don't want to see you make mistakes that we've made, right? So again, this is very general in way of principles of writing up legal agreements or how to even approach them. When it gets into the details, contact Global Genes, and I'm sure we can put you in touch with us or others.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you. Anything to add, Imran, before we go?
I think I would just echo what Emily said, and I think again, maybe even a plug. I really do appreciate and really admire what Global Genes is doing, and I think that they can be a really good resource. And I think that also even I would highlight, I know Global Genes works very closely with Ultragenics. It's another company that I really admire in terms of some of the work that they've done. So for example, they have a boot camp for parents of kids who have rare diseases. And I participated in that boot camp as a speaker. And I think it's just a fantastic program. Just, again, in some ways, it's a balance between being a bit of a reality check in terms of, okay, you really want to get into the drug development business, like this is what's involved. But at the same time, okay, well, here are some of the resources. If you really want to commit to this, these are some of the resources that can be available to you. And Global Genes and Ultragenics, I think, have done a fantastic job and really putting that together. So I think that again, it's always going to be a balance in terms of spending money at the right time, but then also getting the counsel you need to help you on these legal agreements. And then I think that really honing in on key points. And I think from my perspective, business perspective, and not going down rabbit trails that don't at the end of the day really matter. So I think that finding that balance, I think good counsel can help you with that. So really appreciate you all joining, and it's been an honor to be on the panel.
Yes, thank you, Milligan, and thank you, Imran Babar, for leading the discussion today, and thank you to the audience for their questions as well. I think people felt it was very informative. So next up from 2:30 to 3:30 Eastern Time, you can select your next session from the agenda in the auditorium. So we encourage you to make your way to your next very lively discussion. Thank you again, Emily and Imran.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. You take care. Have a good evening.